Welcome back to the Local First FM podcast. We're currently on holiday break, but we've prepared a special episode for you, which was recorded as a Twitter Space conversation between Gordon Brander, Peter van Hardenberg, and Jess Martin. This conversation explores the ideas and trade-offs of apps versus files. I hope you like it.
All right, I guess we're going to get started here pretty soon. So my thinking on this would feel something like we've all been at a conference and we've heard an interesting talk, maybe a lightning talk even, where the person shared like 5 minutes of thought, but not even like they didn't fully elaborate on everything they wanted to say. And the two of us said, hey, you want to go sit down at the conference table and talk through this? Because I feel like there's some interesting stuff here and I have thoughts on it and I would like to work them out loud. So that's kind of my framing.
I love that. We are all, I think, building in one way or another around this problem as well. Is that right, Jess?
Yeah,
We
more or
wanna-
less. Yeah.
You want to maybe like recap what the motivating question was?
Absolutely. The reason this is called file over app, is Capano from Obsidian posted a Twitter post that also I guess there is a link on his website to a fuller article about this. And it's a philosophy that Capano holds. And then the tool called Obsidian also embodies this philosophy. And I'm not going to go into the whole thing now. I'm going to kind of assume that most people can like go and read the post and kind of get his thoughts more fully. But the basic idea is that the tools that we use should store that data in a way that we own the data. And he calls that files. And that the data lives beyond the application itself. So once we've even if the app goes away, we've still got the file, and that file gives us some ability to continue interacting with that data that we've spent such a hard time or had such a long time creating. So that was the impetus. And I think the reason that I wanted to chat about it and reached out to Gordon, and Peter reached out as well, is because I mostly agree with what Capano's saying. And yet there are some subtleties at which I think that probably we would, if Capano was here, that we would part ways. So I'm curious to kind of work out where the subtleties are and then talk about, some real systems that embody this. So,
well, let me make the opposing case, because I think it's
Sure.
important to have both perspectives here, which is files got their asses kicked, right? Like, you want to email people your Google Doc? That's the case here? Oh, I get it. Yeah, you don't want to be able to share a link to a thing. You want to have to send it and then choose a file name for it and get it back, and then something merging something question mark?
Well, make a small change the name of the file, send it back, final
_ March 7th, 24, final as submitted doc, wordx whatever. So, I mean, files got beat because they're worse. What people want is places, not things. And so, okay, now I'm gonna undermine my argument. But like the desirable properties of a Google Doc are that a Google Doc is a place, not a thing, right? So when you join a Google Doc, you are given a key to a place where you can go and collaborate. Now, everything that's wrong with Google Docs also falls out of this, I think. But like, what's great about a file is also what's bad about a file. What's great about a file is that it's a thing that you have. You can't take it away from somebody else who has it, but also they can't take it away from you, right? They have a copy. They can edit it privately, right? They can share it themselves. They can decide what they want to do with it. But like, there are lots of power dynamics as well in terms of like places versus things, right? Which is like, if you've given someone a thing, it's hard to get it back. But if you let someone into a place, you retain perimeter control. You can choose who's let in the future, if they're allowed back, right?
Mm-hmm.
And while there's sort of a fiction about like actually retaining control over data, like, I can screenshot it, I can copy paste it, I can exfiltrate any number of ways. That's like an extra step I have to take versus if I email you a PDF, you've just got it. So I think like that's the beauty of the place, is that it gives the person who creates the data a lot more agency over its destiny. And it gives you a natural collaboration point, kind of by definition.
Yeah. And I know that Gordon was wanting to talk about collaboration as well as like a natural place where files kind of fall down. But I think one of the things that you're mentioning here, one of the things that I think is included in the file over app that isn't mentioned explicitly is the file system, right? It's the It's the container for the file of like, where does that file live? What is the place at which it actually lives? Because it does have a place. It's just not a internet accessible place via URL. And I think that's actually part of Kepano's argument, is that the place where the file lives is a better place than the cloud. He's saying the file lives on a local file system on a device that you control, like a hard drive that it's yours. And that makes it in some senses, a special place or a better place than some of the cloud. And that's what you were mentioning as well, Peter, that like the cloud places enable certain things, file system shaped places enable certain things. Like, how can we get the best of both of those worlds?
Oh, well, that's a different thing, right? You're claiming also, this is a little bit of a category error, right? Like you're arguing like Apple over refrigerator.
Oh, between file and app? You're talking about Kepano or the argument that I just made?
Well, just the sort of framing of the discussion, right? Like there are plenty of apps that work on files, right? It's not the problem here is like apps do not imply the death of files, but there's a culture and a community set of values and a certain sets of expectations, right? Like, are we talking about mobile apps or web apps? You know, this is I think there's a lot of articulation points potentially here.
For sure. And I think the only point that I was making to try and simplify that first point is just, where does the thing live? Is whether the file or the app. Is the file living on my local device? Is it living in the cloud? How do I get to it? Do I have to have a network connection to get to it? Can I get to it locally without a network connection? I think those are all wrapped into Kepano's thinking about the philosophy of file over app.
Yeah, I guess Kepano and all of us are kind of, thinking through this problem from different perspectives. I think he's making a pretty strong rhetorical point. I guess I prefer to look at this in terms of design goals and kind of the qualities of different materials that you can work with rather than what's good or what's bad. Though I'm very drawn to capturing my notes in files myself. I've got 10 years worth of notes, in a folder that's synced, and I've used plenty of SaaS tools over the years, some of which have gone out of business, and I've lost those thoughts. So when I think about, why files, why is Kepano interested in files? There's some areas that I resonate with, and I think files, to your point, they live in a place that you control. The file system is a sort of user-owned substrate. It's old. It was designed in, the 60s and 70s and didn't anticipate a lot of the things that we ended up doing with networks. It has a lot of problems around security and conflicts and many other things that we could get into. But I guess the one thing it does do that the web tends not to do and many apps tend not to do is it does leave you in control of that content. And that's kind of interesting because it means often you can open that data in multiple apps.
Is that true? That's true for plain text. That the opening in multiple apps was the other side of this thing that I think is like not actually true, except in a few very narrow cases, which are the ones that programmers live in, but that much of the rest of the world does not.
Well, much of the rest of the world doesn't live on desktop machines with file systems anymore. I think, again, it's not about it is or it isn't. It's about there are different jobs that people are solving. I think, there are actually a number of things that open up in multiple apps. They tend to have strong power laws. Like there's only a handful that end up working out in this way. But I think that it's better when you have this sort of user-owned substrate where those use cases can emerge permissionlessly.
But the thing is, like I'm reflecting on like the file format wars of the 90s, right? And like the EU legislation to try and like force Microsoft to open the Office Suite's file formats to other participants. And, I don't think that was terribly successful, but, that this is, just because you have the file doesn't mean that you really own it in a sense. Like there are certain properties of it that are quite desirable. And I think this longevity is really remarkable and a really excellent point to bring up. But yeah, there's a tension here between like open file does not imply openness.
Sure, though that can emerge retroactively. Like we saw that happen with PSD and with, the doc format, like
PDFs were proprietary, right? Like
I was going to say PDFs the same way. Yeah.
So the thing that lets that emerge is that substrate that belongs to the user. If it was up to the app, if it was up to Photoshop, they would say, no, a competitor can't open up our file, but they don't get to make that choice. I can open it up in, Affinity Designer or in some sort of other app. And we saw the same thing happen around image formats, around video formats, around 3D formats. They tend to be things that are pretty low level and have like very broad expressive power, so that there's a wide range of jobs to be done that people want to do with them. I also think there's like a Lindy effect around these things. They consolidate around a few, like plain text has a lot of problems, but I fully expect it's going to be here in, 10 years, 20 years, maybe even 100 years.
Plain text.
Define it in whatever way you like, but I suspect whatever way you define it, it's going to last longer than, the Notion API, like Notion.com.
Oh,
right?
certainly. Yeah. Yeah. I guess I'm just pointing out plain text. I often think of it as a fixed point, but if you look back at the history of plain text, right, we go from like ASCII encoding and having to, I don't know if you ever opened up like fileid.diz from like Eastern European countries, which had different ASCII encodings than your, Windows computer did back in the like late 80s, early 90s. But you get
Or
these
even
sort of,
plain text across Windows and Mac, different file endings.
that's
And
right.
so
Yeah.
So you would hand a text file back and forth, and you wouldn't have line breaks where you expected them to be, or you'd have additional line break
Bunch of
characters.
Control M symbols.
Yep.
Yeah.
No, I thought there was a couple areas, like I think Gordon made the point that Capano's making a really interesting rhetorical argument here. I love that he picks a fight here and that he has it's a really nice mantra, but he's definitely cheating a little bit. He cheats files as if they don't have an encoding, like as if like plain text is some given thing. But plain text is an encoding that we had to, like, as you come to adopt it widely enough that there are a large set of readers for that file format. And I think that when you get beyond, I think whether it's programmer usage or not, it's when you get beyond the document format, that's when things start to get, this argument is more difficult it's not as clear because, like canvases, for example, are everywhere now, and there's no single file format for exporting the contents of a canvas, whether it's Muse export or TLDraw has the .tldr file. All of these things, they're not compatible with one another. It feels like the early days of text files, like PVH was just mentioning, where you've got a bunch of different formats. And the weird part about saying file over app is that you still need a reader for the file. Like you have to have some code somewhere that reads that file. And so saying files are better than apps or should be preferred over apps. It's like, well, a file without an app is literally useless. Like you have to have an app to manipulate that file in some way.
Can you define what you mean? Like the word app is carrying a lot of water here. Can you unpack that word a bit?
Sure. I think when I simplify file over app, I think what he's saying is data over logic. In other words, the data or data over behavior, the data stored at rest in some way that you can carry it into the future, own it, copy it from device to device. That's his idea for files, I believe. And he's making that, and then for app, he's basically, I feel like, collapsing apps into databases, basically, of like databases that you don't own. You can't take your individual records from that database and do something with them. They're stored in this mash of things. At least that's why I understood it, is like data over the application logic.
The term we use at InconSwitch is tools, not apps.
Can you expand on that a little bit?
The concept is that an app in its sort of cultural construction, though not necessarily in its technical requirements, generally implies that, it holds the data inside it. I think mobile apps and web apps both have different kind of habits here, right? Like for the most part, a mobile app is a hermetically sealed box. Nothing gets in or out of it. You can't open your Apple Notes in Dropbox or, Notepad or, anything else. That's not necessarily true, but it is practically culturally the case. And so the idea is that tools operate on some kind of material, right? And so Obsidian has strong tool culture, right? Like one of the interesting things with Obsidian and reflecting on Gordon's comments is just that like Markdown and like Obsidian doesn't operate on plain text. It operates on Markdown, but there's no such thing as Markdown. There's like as many Markdowns as there are apps that use some grammar of Markdown, but you get like a certain amount of interoperability because there's like these really nice, graceful degradation patterns.
Yeah, Markdown's like an escalator. It can't break. It can only become text, right? So like it's kind of an inspired choice from that perspective. But I think your point is well taken. Like these formats, they tend to layer And it sort of necessarily, like interoperability is an ecological condition. It's something that emerges over time. You don't design it. This is actually why for me, sort of permissionless substrates that belong to the user, where their data is saved, seems important because it allows interoperability to emerge retroactively. But in any case, like these things, they tend to emerge over time where, one person creates a format, another kind of app implements it. It doesn't happen often, but when it does happen, it tends to be very valuable.
It's often
And
oppositional though, isn't it?
it's often oppositional and often happens in layers. Like I think that, text is on top of, bytes, and then markdown is on top of text. And then we have like Obsidian layering their own sort of like bespoke markup forms on top of markdown. And these layers tend to move at different speeds, with the lowest layers kind of necessarily moving slower. Like the part of the problem that's standardized and that people can interoperate around is necessarily the part that has to move slowly.
Well,
and
Markdown's
innovate
not
slowly.
standardized, right? Like it's an emergent, like cultural phenomenon.
It's de facto, right? Like there's sort of flavors that people converge on, like GitHub flavored. And like all standards are sort of cultural constructions at some level. Yeah, you're right. It's not like standardized in like W3C or IETF sense.
Or even in the Unix POSIX sense, right? Like files are, these kinds of bytes and these kinds of orders, and this is how you end a file.
But there are a couple of emerging standards, right? We're at the situation where there's multiple plain text formats of Markdown, right? There's Common Mark and different parsers that you can adopt that give you true guarantees around the way that Markdown's. But there's, as you said,
there's no one.
Yeah, this actually seems important to me. Like I think a lot of people think about standards and interoperability as these sort of Platonic forms that we design in standards bodies. And, while that's true that there are people who craft that kind of material, it's like typically done in retrospect. And in real life, cooperation usually happens in this sort of ad hoc or de facto way. And when our systems aren't designed to support that, it's not a huge surprise that, interoperability doesn't emerge. And then we can sort of point and say, well, nobody wants to interoperate. It's like, well, yeah, because the material doesn't support it. Like there's a kind of chicken or the egg problem here, right?
Well, I think both in your work and Jess's work and our work, right? Like we're all exploring different ways of exposing the substrate in more interoperable ways.
Yeah.
And it's not so much like locking the door open as like right now, I think like the political economy of choosing files over these other things, right? Like if it's so much harder and worse for you as a developer to choose like a file-like thing over an API-like thing, you're probably going to pick the API-like thing, right?
Indeed.
So some of this is like technical capability and some of it is cultural norms.
Yep.
Yeah. Like files are just a thing that's there. And they're actually in many ways an odd shaped thing for the problems we're trying to solve. But they're just, at least in the App Store and on the web, there aren't really good viable alternatives yet. Like in the browser, we're starting to get things like the file API. And on iOS, we're starting to get like a little bit of a sort of file system type thing.
So it was
But
very
these-
charming when Apple excitedly announced files like they'd invented.
Yeah, totally. Right. But it's actually kind of telling that like, why is it actually that we want this? It seems like a lot of knowledge work that's not commoditized kind of needs to cross boundaries of multiple apps. And this is just the only tool we currently have to do it. Mostly because there haven't been good commercial incentives to build interoperability layers that make sense on the network.
Mm-hmm.
At least not yet.
Well, you still need a data container, right? Like that's one of the nice things that files make is like this, relatively this thing that has boundaries that contains a certain amount of data that you can then pass around via a whole bunch of different.
Yeah, it's a unit
vehicles.
of sharing.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm actually curious. So for people who are listening who don't know Peter's work, he's working on a CRDT, which is basically a data structure. Think of it's called AutoMerge, and AutoMerge actually calls their unit of merging a document. So Peter, do you guys think of AutoMerge documents as files in this file-like way we've been describing, or do you think of them in a different way?
The specific stated intention of AutoMerge is to invent the new file system of computing. Like the CRDT thing is just like an implementation detail. The problem is we don't want places and we don't want things. We need properties of both. right? There's a
Mhm.
wave particle duality here. We don't want to give up
Yes.
the good things about files, things that we have, things that we can hold, things we can maintain, things we can keep for as long as we want, that we can use in whatever way that we want. We can pop open the hood and peer under the covers, right? Like all that stuff is I think vital. But like it's so apparent that the POSIX metaphor of the literally 1970s, right? The series of bytes, it assumes single access, right? Like God, the amount of my career I've spent trying to figure out how to lock a file system. You know, there's so many tricks that we use in like professional contexts to cope with like
Shared mutable state.
shared mutable
Yeah.
state. And the whole idea behind AutoMerge was to say like, look, what if you could really think about this, really take your time, really sweat all the details, not be in the rush that a startup's in, not, spend years with Martin Kleppmann proving the algorithm correctly, then spend years with, Orion and Alex Good getting the performance right. And people are like, oh, AutoMerge is this, AutoMerge is that. AutoMerge is just getting started, right? Like this is a 10-year project. It's a 50-year project. It's a thing that you just keep working on until it works. And I think at this point, a lot of the pieces are in place and we're starting to see that pay out. And if anybody's following Ink and Switch's patchwork project right now, right? Like what we're seeing is like this ability to do ad hoc, like new forms of real-time and asynchronous version control on top of this substrate because it has the right primitives. And of course, this is a research project. So in the process of working on this, we're discovering the ways that the APIs are insufficient or where we need to add new kinds of indexing to improve performance or, all those other kinds of things. But it's sort of like we've talked to so many people. I was talking to someone over at Scratch the other day and they were saying like, oh, I did this in my thesis, but like it wasn't actually possible to build because we didn't have the material. Right. And like a former collaborator, Blaine Cook, who was a co-author on the Upwelling paper we did last year, he was saying like, it's so amazing getting to work on this stuff. He did a startup 5 years ago or something where he tried to build, text editing tools, but like they didn't have the material. And so it's about trying to figure out what the shape of that material is. And, I hadn't brought it up before because I don't want this to be about a particular like concept that I have or that we have about a single technology, but it's about like really thinking about what the opportunities are and the potential. But I think a lot about this question, right? Like, I don't want my computer to be a mall where I go in and I take products out one at a time, and bring them home and consume them and put them in the trash. I want my computer to feel like a wood shop where I have my stock of lumber and I've got my tools. And if I want to make something, sure, it's going to require a little more thinking and expertise, but I can make anything, I can do anything, I can work with other people, right? Like it's a different kind of productivity. Like a kitchen is very much the same thing as well, right? We buy groceries, we buy staples, and a handful of like basic tools, a cutting board, a heat source, a knife. You can do almost anything in the kitchen. With a few extra things, you can do remarkable things, right? And like, we reject the idea of unitask devices often. We make fun of people who buy the one-off gadgets for the kitchen, but then we live in a world of these one-off gadgets on our devices, on our computers, right? I'm trying to think like, if we're going to invent tools, we also need to figure out what the stock material is. And like, yeah, text files are cool because they're old, and like what's old is good. Like I don't mean that in a dismissive way. Like it is cool because
stood
it's
the
old.
test of time. Exactly.
And it will stand the test of time. It will still be here in 50 years if it was here in 50 years or 50 years. SQLite is amazing too. Simon Willison's super inspiring there, working on like data set and these kinds of ideas where it's like, yeah, like a database is a file. Like that's awesome.
Yeah. It's more or less written by actual monks as well. So it really does feel like a kind of cathedral of technology that'll be here in 1,000 years.
Yeah, I hope so.
Yeah, I think I love that woodshop metaphor, and it's often one that I think about. It's so evocative because if you've worked in a woodshop and you understand all the things that the ways that you're able to modify your shop and your tools in order to get work done, and then you just put that same lens and look at your computer, you realize how incredibly rigid the computer is, even when you're a software developer who has an ideological commitment to using open source software where you have the source of every single application that you use. The difficulty in modifying those applications to your own custom specifications is astronomical compared to
we need
working.
new models and metaphors.
Yeah, the
Brian?
new materials you're talking about.
It's great. I was reading Brian Kernighan's biography. It looks like the C programming language, but it's his self-published thing. Unix, a history and a memoir. And it's a funny book, but there's some really great parts in it where he talks about sort of like the invention of Unix pipelines and how it was sort of like somebody would ask how you could do X with a computer, or with this new pipes thing they'd built. And then, him or Richie or somebody would go off and like write the next little piece, sort or whatever, so that they could answer that puzzle. And I just love this sort of like they discovered the Lego bricks. They built the shape and then they just filled in a few pieces. And then after a little while, it was kind of like, yeah, all the major pieces are there and that was good enough. And they stuck, it's still out there and you can still use it, but it's not really the best way to do spell check anymore,
You're such a glorious vision, though. I guess for me, like files are not the thing, but what they are, at least for particular formats, is like a kind of Lego dot. And producing Lego dots like this that allow you to compose things together, like Unix pipe is another kind of Lego dot. This strikes me as important in like a laws of physics kind of way. Like one of my favorite books, W. Brian Arthur's
The Nature of Technology.
I always get it confused with Kevin Kelly's book, but the nature of technology, he basically makes this very sort of mathematically grounded argument that innovation at its core is a combinatorial process, and not just like technological innovation, but evolution, language, art. Like these are about taking pieces, composing them together to produce something new in a sort of recursive process. And like early computing was all kind of like, I don't know if this was intuitive or chance or what, all of these early pioneers of computing designed their systems in this way. And we saw this kind of Cambrian explosion of really interesting new things emerge very rapidly. Like actually, we've had mobile phones for longer than it took the browser to be invented after the introduction of DOS. So it's like a lot happened in like a very short amount of time in that first wave, right? And part of me kind of wonders that if we sort of reduced the combinatoriality of technology to actually slow the rate of innovation, not necessarily like there's someone scheming in a room, but sort of the purpose of the system is what it does, and like big money, but also kind of governments and
it's eternal September, right?
Yeah, it's like
September.
If you have a bunch of silos and those silos do one thing, like on Instagram, you post photos, and on TikTok, you post short videos, and there is no such thing as combining those into some new medium because they don't let you. And so you kind of have these known quantities that you can regulate and control and also extract 30% taxes on pretty efficiently. So there's this kind of like striation that's happened of the space. Mm-hmm. And some of this is probably inevitable, but I do kind of want to click the dial a couple notches in the other direction, just by nature.
I kind of think this is the way you describe that is, to me, a lost cause. Or maybe lost cause isn't actually the right term for it. What I mean is that actually a television is great if you want to watch Love is Blind.
Is everything necessarily a television? No. Like, no, so this is the point. And so what I think though is like, I don't think we should be trying to convince the mainstream systems to change their minds or solve the problems we want to solve. It's that we need to, like a wood shop is not the right way to build an IKEA, assembly line, right? Like, but we need the existence of this other kind of computing. It is not a replacement for, it is an alternative to, for the people who want it and need it. Yeah, we don't disagree. Like there's always going to be Facebook, and there's always going to be like the Big Bang Theory or whatever. But I would love for there also be like a world where like there can be, I don't know, independent films, or hell, like Dune 2 is like something that's kind of in the air and kind of strikes that balance in a nice and interesting way. It just feels like what we want is diversity. We want like a technological ecosystem that can actually support plurality of different ends and not just like Walmart.
Yeah, and the political economy is the challenge here, right? Which is that right now it costs so goddamn much to write a piece of software. It's like completely untenable to build or operate software at all. And I say this as somebody who has done quite a lot of it at all scales, in production. It is just insane. We think of software as an informational good, right? Like that's sort of the like conceptual model. Oh, it's just some bits on floating around, but it's not. It's like a whole like massive amount of extremely expensive infrastructure that's operated by a priesthood of like DevOps people who sacrifice themselves to get up at 3 a.m. to figure out why the transaction wraparound on the Postgres has happened again. That, like it's hell. It's crazy.
Yeah. The strange economics of software, I guess, support that kind of like rising floor. Because if you do have a hit, it tends to make a ton of money, and then all of that's a rounding error.
Yeah, it's the network effects. The complexity of software is determined by the economic value that can be extracted from the software.
Yeah. And that sort of sets the floor as well, right? Like if you're making not thousands but billions on a success, then you can afford,
to burn out a bunch of software engineers and, leave them staggering around their hometown, gazing bleary-eyed into the morning light and wondering where their life went wrong.
At the same time, like these economic incentives, they create individual choices for like individual developers. And I think that's where a lot of the slowdown has happened, is when there weren't options if you were into computers in the 60s to go make whatever the 60s equivalent of $450,000 a year, and kind of at a cushy job where they, bring food to your table and you can get up and take foosball breaks whenever you want. Like the cruise ship mentality, I think, lures a lot of people away. And I think it's really hard to kind of wake them up to the fact that software doesn't have to be this way. We might have to do a little work. We might have to be a little uncomfortable for a little while. But
you got to make the right thing the easy thing. That was the lesson we learned in Heroku. If you make the right thing the easy thing, people will do it. I agree. All of the principles and ideals, like, there's a certain amount of cultural affinity, and there'll always be some like weirdos and early adopters. But ultimately, if you want to win the day, you have to make the right thing the easy thing.
But you need some people doing that, making the right thing the easy thing. And I think that's what I'm talking about, is like, I want to find that 2% or 3% of the developer population who actually wants to do the work and make the right thing the easy thing. And for that, you need to have these wonderful mantras that Capano and that Peter and Gordon, you guys have honed over the years. Actually, Gordon, to turn the conversation a bit to your work, because you are working on a network thinking tool that captures those thoughts in document files, one might say. And you have not chosen to use Markdown. You've made some interesting technical choices. So I'm curious how, when you look at file over app, are you like, yes, that aligns with the decisions that I'm making right now for the tool that I'm building? Or how are your thoughts different from kind of what you've seen Capano lay out?
Yeah, it's a good question. I guess what we are building is a sort of notebook app called Subconscious, powered by this decentralized note graph protocol. And the protocol's multiplayer. So the notion is like, what if you had your Roam graph or your Obsidian graph, but it could sort of freely network with other graphs in this cloud of graphs. But that cloud of graphs doesn't live on my server where I can sort of, extract 30% text or whatever. It exists on this decentralized network. Actually, that's not quite right either. The protocol's local first. So basically it syncs your slice of the graph, like your content plus the content of people you follow, onto your devices. So you have your files. And this was...
To be clear, right? They are actually files.
They're actually files.
If you run orb on or what you guys used to call it, orb.
It's called orb. Yeah, no, it's called orb. There's a couple things, right? There's the app, but there's also like a command line interface you can use if you're a developer that's like Git. And actually it works a lot like Git. The whole thing uses kind of Git-like versioning semantics. The difference is that it syncs not just your quote unquote repository of notes, but also kind of those of the people you follow. So you have your own little internet archive, I guess.
Right. You like Git, it's like Git submodules. Or that's a terrible example.
Yeah.
No, don't say that. That's mean. It's not like that. I promise. It's much better than that.
It's all versioned together. I mean, without getting deeply into the details, it's all sort of versioned together. This is part of, I guess, what's a little bit different from something like Git, or why you just
right.
I guess a lot of what we're doing.
At some point during your usage of this, you will end up with actual files on your device. Which is very different than most other systems that we interact with right now. Obsidian being one of the ones that you do end up with files on your device. But that's a choice you guys made.
The files are, I guess you could say, they're a lens over the data on the protocol. And for me, being able to get a live sync instance of those files on a device is sort of proof of what what we call credible exit. So this is like our minimal definition of what sort of user ownership of data should mean for our tools, for the way we choose to build for it. Is like, you should be able to take your stuff and leave or bring it into another app or whatever. Now, I think Obsidian actually has credible exit as well. And they do this through files, but I think they have some maybe tricky edge cases around multiplayer. And this is because, files, one of the shortcomings of files is they just don't do multiplayer really well on two axes, actually. One is most file formats are not designed to sort of freely merge updates from a bunch of different sources. Like Peter edits the file, I edit the file. How do we resolve those conflicts? The other sort of axis around which file systems are not really well designed for multiplayer is around security. So once you have multiple players, it's sort of an adversarial environment, or you have to design for that anyway.
You have to predict the emergence of an adversarial environment.
Yeah, because, imagine you're reading and writing these files, and then you just connect this thing to the internet. What if 4chan suddenly has write access to your hard drive? Like that's the worst case that you.
Well, this was the Mystic Scuttlebutt had too, right? Which is they did this like replicating friends of friends thing, and then you only had to compromise one person's friend graph, and all of a sudden you were, you could sort of sneak someone into the graph and then have everybody else back up your objectionable content for you. Right. And then this became a major problem because everything was append only and everything was replicated and everything was encrypted. And all of a sudden you're downloading gigabytes of like terrible hate speech or other kinds of nasty stuff because, somebody made like a face account, infiltrated a community and then like, linked in all their like hateful people that they want to follow. And now everybody else is like stuck mirroring their content. It gives them, again, this system of replicating friends of friends content is very easily gamed by an adversary.
Yeah, and I guess it's important to kind of define your
risk profile.
The threat model. Yeah, like, is your threat model that like about replicating friends of friends content? I think browsers, for example, are even coping with this in a more pedestrian, not a decentralized way, but like they're introducing the file API, which actually will allow you to save files out from the browser in a sort of, so you could go to photoshop.com, edit a photo, and that saves it out to your disk. And this is something I worked on when I was at Chrome a little bit, and it has a lot of thorny issues. Actually, most of the browsers only partially support it right now, or support, certain parts of it, because the way the web secures content around domains is very different, sort of comes in at an odd angle to the way file systems think about security. And so anytime you have these two sort of security models butting up against each other, you have this turbulence zone where all sorts of funny, scary things can happen, and you need to deal with that. This is a pretty tricky problem. It's one that we've taken a stab at for our use case. But I think often you'll run into this dilemma that isn't immediately obvious, but you can typically you can either have sort of files or data ownership or multiplayer, but not both, unless you start picking apart some of the security problems that the web has, sort of left us with, some of that security stack.
Gordon, when you say unless you pick apart some of the security problems, what I hear you saying is like you have to solve for sort of the identity / network / authentication authorization piece in order to get files in collaboration. Like it implies that there are multiple, writers that are different, and you have to somehow allow them to communicate with one another, allow them to identify one another, and then also allow them to secure content, set up the rules for who can write, when, how, all of that kind of thing. Is that?
Yeah. I think that's right. I've personally become convinced of the value of, and this is rather low level stuff, but signing everything with a key that maps one-to-one to you.
Oh,
and I think,
hold on, everything? What does everything mean? Because this is a specific technical problem that we're like quite deeply investigating right now. Because like you sign every keystroke on a 200,000 keystroke essay, like the Embark essay, and what you have is mostly signatures.
I like the way that you love MIP mapping, don't you, Peter? Like going one level more granular with definitions.
Well, it's tough because this like you have to constantly be moving up and down these hierarchies of abstraction when you're working on these problems, right? So like, Noosphere is cool because you can operate at this very coarse, chunky grain. But when you say everything, this is why I'm asking, like, does this exclude that kind of lower real-time thing? Maybe this is a solvable technical problem. Just curious what you think about that.
Well, and I suppose you might be able to sign at the granularity you care about, right? I guess what I mean is the web anchors security to domains. So the way the web thinks about security is it's guaranteed by a domain. If you want to start making attestations about people or individuals or actors on the network, then you start maybe wanting to give those actors keys in some capacity. And now I think there's, sort of the cypherpunk view of it, which is that these keys should be self-sovereign. And I sort of think that that's a possibility that a protocol should allow for, but a lot of people are going to want to escrow those keys or have them recovered. It doesn't a detail that users shouldn't have to care about most of the time, right?
Yeah, and an important one too.
Yeah. But what signing with keys does is it allows for what a cryptographer called non-repeatability. Like you can basically say, this person definitely signed this at this time, or at least the person who had control of these keys. And if you keep those keys secure, you can actually sort of compose trust at pretty high levels in pretty useful ways mathematically. So in any case, I think where the file system and the network tend to run up against each other at odd angles is the internet, or the web rather, tends to think about security in terms of origins and of domains. And actually apps by and large adopted that security model as well, like iOS apps, Android apps. And the file system tends to think of security in terms of who has access to the device. And these two ways of thinking about security don't mix very well without some sort of trust boundary or sandbox boundary that mediates that relationship.
Can you talk more about this? Because I've had many conversations with like browser heads, and like I get the idea of an origin. And let me see if I can say this in a way that like a non-browser head, I mean, maybe I'm a browser person now too by fate, but like an origin is basically like somebody owns the SSL cert for this DNS. And so we're just going to trust everything within that domain that's signed by that cert, period. But we're going to prevent mixing of that data, unless it helps us sell ads, with any data from any other origin, period. I mean, I'm a little bit, snide when I say that, but it is a very real concern, and it is very empirically how ads work. And, however you feel about that, it is the case.
That sounds like a pretty accurate description to me. We're pretty far down the rabbit hole on this stuff. Do we want to keep going?
Well, the reason why I think it's relevant to the files conversation where we started and the apps conversation is that origin model is many people I meet who work on these kinds of problems, they get really frustrated by like cores and same origin policies. And the browser keeps ratcheting these tighter and tighter and tighter over time, except for these. Yeah, exactly. And so to me, this is actually a really fundamental problem where it's like, well, but it's my computer. I want to decide what I do with my data. And then in the JavaScript console, it's like browser says no. And
actually
right. But like
the most secure web would be one where each website is hermetically sealed and you can neither interact with it nor receive output from it. It's just little pocket universes. So, I mean, there's a sort of like reductio ad absurdum to this where like we started with a pretty simple, it was like a reasonable solve, right? At a time, especially in the early days of the web when they were like, I think the mental model was that you might run a server out of a closet, or perhaps your school would run a server. Like it was this very utopian kind of flat notion of what a network would be. And so the server was assumed to be the agent of the, let's say Gordon's email would be like a computer that was like in my closet. And so like,
.com was a machine, or at least a process.
If that server is signing things, you can sort of say, oh, well, Gordon's signing things, but that's not really the world we ended up with because of network effect, because of
Facebook
scale.
signs everything.
Yeah. Now, keys are tricky, like because they're these funny little things that you can't lose, just like in real life, or you'll be locked out.
But there are no locksmiths.
There are no locksmiths. Yeah, at least unless the NSA has its way, But
no. But
I do have some hope that we're going to see some interesting kind of new calculus emerge around this problem with the advent of like trusted computing modules like Secure Enclave on the iPhone, or I forget what the Android version is called, which makes me a bad former Googler, but you can sort of stash keys on these secure pieces of hardware, and then you have a pretty, I mean, maybe your threat model is the NSA has your phone and is trying to crack into it, but that's less the world I'm trying to solve for and more the world of like, it would be kind of nice to know if this.
I think Bonzi Buddy is a really credible threat model, right? Like that's sort of the core threat model that browser vendors think about, right? Which is you've got some like hostile agent on the user's computer. They've installed ostensibly a search toolbar or some kind of browser plugin, which is now like extracting their credit card information or their Bitcoins or just other private information.
Yeah. So why does this matter? Well, so like this origin security model inevitably results in silos, like by definition, data silos. Like the silo is the website. The whole security model is that the data can't make it out of the website. And so you just sort of end up with.
Well, it does at the server, right? That's the funny thing.
The server. That's
right. So they run an API so you can come in from other places there, but the user can't do it for themselves.
Yeah. And then this puts the server in a very privileged and powerful position on the network because an API can cut you off. So data that might be notionally yours is in practice, it's not really. I don't know. If you want to try to solve for that problem in some capacity, like multiplayer and some kind of data ownership or the ability to take your content with you, I think there's only 3 ways to solve this. One is with a decentralized protocol, and without going too much deeper into it, the protocol also has to have certain security qualities. I think the other is actually with local first data, and this is Peter's working on this problem of CRDP. Is the reason local first data gets you this is because, a server might cut you off, but it's like, screw you, buddy. I already have my content, right? It was already synced to my device.
No, but that's not true. Like I wish I appreciate the compliment implied there, but I think you still require the first thing, right? Because like when you get the data, like this idea of local first data, if it's happening in your browser, it's still being written into an index DB or an OPFS or whatever else that's owned by the origin. There is the ability to write real files, but it sucks and doesn't really work. And I see some folks here who have like built apps, like no one is making a user click like allow access to this folder every time they open an app.
Gosh. Yeah. So that's what the file access API. Yeah.
Right. Like, so all of that data is still trapped inside the origin.
Yeah, I'm sure that's true.
So Peter, you were saying
I have a third point. I have a third point. Yeah. And actually I do want to say CRDTs are still important. You're talking
totally.
But too much.
It doesn't solve the origin thing. And that's the part I don't have a good on.
Let me circle back to this. I just want to throw out
please.
One time over coffee, you told me you don't need to care about which protocol you get the data from if the file knows how to merge itself. And I thought that was a wonderful provocation to sort of like argue in favor of the CRDT. And all of these are satisficing, right? Like a protocol, a CRDT, these are not going to give you perfect exit in any case because, in the worst case, you might be shut out from the app that lets you use this stuff in a useful way. But I do think they give you the ground conditions for things like adversarial interoperability to emerge. But the third thing, and the one that I think is underexplored, and I haven't even thought through it fully, is something like a legal contract that guarantees the user access to their data along some axes as long as a service continues to be maintained.
You mean like a UCAN or like an actual like TNC?
Like something like so, and this is the thing, nothing like this exists today, but there's no reason you couldn't write something like a EULA where the valence goes the other direction. Instead of the user signing away their rights, the user is granted certain rights over their data.
Hey, I'll take that to my lawyer and
no, actually, I've been thinking,
when I ask him for this,
I sense some irony there, but if you're interested in it, I was thinking about actually going to a lawyer and asking, is this crazy? Because like open source would have been crazy at one time, but it's interesting, right? Like we actually can bend contract law in some interesting directions to solve using social technologies, things that are difficult to solve with, bits and atoms technologies.
Right. Well, and the challenge here is not even could you write a contract that would do this? The question is like, how would this affect your ability to fundraise, or what would happen when you told your VP of sales what you were doing?
Yeah, maybe so. I think you run into a lot of these same problems when you say, hey, we're going to give users control over their data through a protocol or through a CRDT anyway. So, it's like in a lot of ways, like this condition of things not interoperating and users not owning their data, like an investor might look at that and say, that's a moat, right?
It is a moat.
Yeah, I tend to think about this in like longer terms. It's like in some ways, like Google doesn't have like a lock on search. Like it keeps trying with things like the Open Graph. But I think it's perfectly possible to build a defensible business without data lock-in. But it's something you get for free with the current software paradigm. And so we're sort of stuck in this metastable state where nobody wants to do the extra work.
This is where I think things like your protocol or AutoMerge or other kinds of similar projects have potential. If you can crack what you need is enough benefit from participating in the ecosystem that allows you to get like network style returns from interoperation over time.
Yeah.
Right. You need a low enough activation cost that you can bootstrap the ecosystem around it. There has to be enough value from adopting the technology to see that kind of like feedback on the returns. And I think the other thing that we haven't talked about that is implicit in all of this is like the political economy of the software that is available to us is determined by like the market economy of the labor market and the VC funding market and everything else. And like, it's all well and good to like hand wave that away, but it is empirically the case, like information may want to be free, but my rent isn't.
I think I look at this as in like a kind of scrappy, maybe like entrepreneurial way. I'm looking for the cheap hack because I don't want to wait for the abolition of capitalism to improve software somewhat. And I do think there are these kinds of judo moves, these interventions like CRDTs that can change the calculus.
What a coincidence.
Yeah, maybe I'm wrong, right? And maybe you're wrong. Maybe we're all wrong, but I don't think so. I think that it requires great ingenuity and creativity to find the strategic angle of intervention. But, people do this all the time. They do it they apply strategy to find an entry into a market in order to gain, because incumbents don't want new entrants in the market either. And I think we have to put that hat on actually, if we're going to change the balance of power that users have.
How do you think about that with what you're doing? Oh, sorry, Jess.
No, it's okay. I was going to mention, I think I loved your three things, Gordon. There's three ways you can solve the problem, like some decentralized protocol or two distributed local file state, like distributed local state. And then the third, sort of a legal contract. And I think the one Peter was pointing out that the market economics right now, what is easy is also very profitable. And therefore the labor market and the funding market where it drives against any of these values, and it supports sort of the data moats that we were talking about before with the same origin policy. And I think the biggest funding mechanism that I see, Peter's not going to love this, that is alternative to VC right now, is there is a large lump of money in the Web3 blockchain world. And you do see some of those projects putting that to use to try to solve this problem. So
yes, the famously anti-capitalist distributed wealth system of the cryptocurrency market, known for its transparency, honesty, and fair outcomes for all involved. Yes.
You're not wrong. And also there's a lot of money there. And so this is kind of like, it's basically the flip of what you were just saying. Is like, we have to acknowledge the reality of the market economics. Well, the reality of the market economics is that there is billions of dollars in these decentralized protocols that are basically payment rails for distributing tokens and things like that. And a lot of shady, crazy stuff is happening there for sure. But they are
tell me about the stuff that's not, because I think that's interesting.
So here's the one that this is the reason I brought it up, is I don't know if you guys have been paying attention to the Farcaster protocol, but they're distributed social media protocol, and they have been iterating on this thing called frames. And frames are like a micro app within a tweet. If you could embed, and the interesting thing about it, they're opting for Gordon's option 1 for distributing state and access and all of that.
Yeah, they actually, their protocol is not too different from Blue Sky or even our own Newsphere, but it does make a couple of choices around key rotation and they use a blockchain for this. I could get into the why if we want to later on.
Well, here's the more interesting thing. Just today, they showed off frames that allow for token transfers to happen inside of it. So basically they built into their protocol micropayments. And
Mm-hmm.
the reason I think this is really interesting is because I think one way out of this, the current world that we're in with browsers and same origin policy and the sort of the dead end, but it's a happy dead end where the web is building a payment protocol into the primitives of the network itself, such that people can remunerate each other directly. And so,
You know, the web was meant to have this. There's an HTTP code for payment, like pay-per-view. It just never got. Yeah. It's like Tim Berners-Lee just stuck it in there. It's along there with like what is that? There's another code for I am a teapot. There's like these funny like reserved codes for just in case that Tim Berners-Lee stuck in there, and payment was one. We just never got. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what you were going to ask with regard to Web3. I think the idea of like digital payments is not crazy on its face, and it would be interesting to think about ways to do that with a protocol. I think my stance with regard to Web3 is sure to piss literally everyone off on both sides of this very kind of like divisive issue, which is that I think that I look at a blockchain as a really interesting technological artifact that does solve some problems that are very difficult to solve in other ways. But the number of people who want to solve those problems is small. And nevertheless, they can be high value. So these are things like key rotation, which Farcaster uses. There's always been a challenge with key rotation where you need like a third party to basically handle that rotation. And that third party is kind of like a point of failure if someone co-ops it. But in any case, you know, here's where I'm going to piss everyone else off on the crypto side is like, I think all of the problems of crypto are not crypto problems. They're market problems. And if you look at them point for point, like, you know, tulip mania, wildcat banking, crazy token pump and dump, these are literally all things that we had to go through with regard to capitalism in general, markets in general, for the last 200 years. And then we accrued this enormous edifice of regulation around markets in order to get them to function. So my personal attitude toward this stuff, which probably a lot of people are going to disagree with for one ideological reason or another, is like markets are kind of like nuclear reactors. They can generate a lot of interesting outcomes, but they also have a tendency to melt down without cooling rods. And this is just kind of what I see happening with crypto. And I think it'll continue to happen up until the point that it gets some sort of enlightened regulation, which may never come because it seems like nobody's actually invested in that outcome on either side. So there's Gordon's unpopular take with regard to Web3.
I love it. So Web3 speed running 200 years of financial market regulation. And
and actually, especially to me, like proof of stake blockchains are a really interesting technology that solve like an interesting problem of like decentralized, totally ordered sort of source of truth, incredibly neutral. These terms all have to be qualified because, you know, they're all of that is also kept afloat by like basically the financial function that chain is supposed to serve. But I think the product market fit that chains have found right now is basically Vegas. And, you know, crypto just recently skyrocketed back up again. So I've come to the conclusion that Vegas is actually anti-fragile and you can't kill it. But that's also something Vegas is not personally my favorite place to be. So if I engage with it, it's, you know, kind of with care and with a little bit of self-protection.
Yeah. I mean, I think Jess has certain expectations about my perspective on these things that are not entirely unfair, but I would say I'm not anti-crypto conceptually. I'm just opposed to getting dragged into the kinds of communities that I've seen. You know, I just like the ideas are reasonable. It's just the outcomes seem odious. So
Man,
I'm just
that
like,
describes so many things.
When there's like a healthy, high functioning cryptocurrency for like micropayments that isn't like an insane pump and dump, penny stock, gambling, whatever, right? Like, that would be cool. I always ask if anybody has one in mind and nobody does. But in the meantime, I also think it's a little bit irrelevant because like, oh man, use PayPal, use there's lots of use Square Cash, like use a freaking credit card, like there's payment is there's more friction than you'd like, but like Stripe is pretty good. There's alternatives and wrapper API. Like these are hard problems, but they're so much less hard than they used to be. And they're, you know, Apple Pay is pretty great. Like, you know, like we don't need to invent a whole new financial economy to do payments. But I do think broadly, like we got a little bit off track here, which is like,
Files.
well, no, it's files over apps. And I think again that like we have to ask why are things the way they are?
Yeah.
And so things are the way they are because you can make a living building software that way. You can get
Mhm.
investment from other
That's
people
exactly
to
right.
build software. And if you
Yep.
can't get investment and you can't make a living, then you're not going to have the ability to attract top talent, right? To bring in the
Mhm.
investment it takes to build a team in advance of revenue, right?
Mhm.
And like the problem with crypto money is that it always ends up being predicated on like the promise of crypto style returns in sort of the, idealized
Right.
case. And so what you see is like ecosystems aligning around trying to generate one of those crypto pops because that's the expectation that comes with the investment. And I think I don't want to call anybody out. I'll just say that there have been very interesting and promising projects that have over time had to realign themselves to generating crypto interest style returns, and that has very frequently been to the detriment of their mission.
Right.
Yeah, token pumping tends to be an unstoppable force.
Yeah.
Once you
And
get in that doom loop.
yeah, and I wasn't necessarily bringing up Web3 to say that that was the solution, but I do think the acknowledging there's two things that I think are interesting here. One, how do you fund the research into making easy what we believe to be the future? And one of those funding sources that is non-VC is a pool of cash that is Web3 that has all
Yeah.
sorts of other challenges with it.
Right, but look at what's happened there, right? Like really specifically, look at what's happened there.
Well,
Right.
I do actually, I want to take Jess's perspective on this for a
Sure.
minute, because I sort of gave my, like very boring, ambivalent take on it. But like, I think actually if I remove my moral valence, like there are a lot of things that seem crazy on their face that generate unexpected outcomes. And like, I see a lot of money getting dumped into things like ZK proofs, which is a general purpose cryptographic technology that has nothing to do with chains. Work has been mostly funded by blockchain maxis. I see interesting work on elliptic curves, like Zuko Wilcox's work on elliptic curves that's being done around this. Actually, we use IPFS. IPFS ecosystem has this new kind of, I guess you could think of it as like a zip format for blocks that you can stream in, and it's all sort of like signed in the way that you can sort of stream this stuff in and cryptographically verify the blocks as they come in. It's using this elliptic curve technology that was ultimately developed by Zuko Wilcox for ZK stuff, Zcash, I
Yeah,
believe.
and UCANs from the Fission team are another great
Mhm.
example. I think they've taken a lot of
Yeah.
research funding from those kinds of sources. I think that's good stuff.
Exactly. Yeah.
I think we're seeing like Farcaster and Blue Sky and Noster and various sort of stabs at decentralized protocols that actually don't really have a crypto component, but I think are benefiting greatly from the mental
Mhm.
models developed by cryptographic researchers, as well as cryptocurrency researchers. Yeah. So I think, it's like there's this quote I really like from this evolutionary biologist who says containment can lead to contagion, and a degree of isolation is of great importance in sort of new forms being evolved. So it's like the island ecology thing. Like if something's off to the side and it's under a set of different selection pressures, you could be like, those selection pressures are perverse. They're terrible. Maybe they are, but you're going to get some weird and interesting critters that emerge out of that primordial soup, for good or ill, right? Like I definitely think that we're seeing some things emerge out of the crypto landscape that wouldn't emerge out of the incentives of like the Web 2.0 aggregator kind of landscape.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, we're about a little over an hour in. Let me see if I can try to land the plane here and kind of recap the conversation we've had so far. So we kind of jumped in with this files over apps and kind of talking about some of our different work around this. And then there was a lot of history discussion around sort of how did we get to the current system where apps could even be used in a sentence like file over app. And what does that mean for where we are today? And then I think the most recent exploration has been, how do we get somewhere else? How do we get to a place where files to echo Peter's opening comment, where files didn't get their butts kicked and where we can actually rely on some of the file like goodness that we get, where we can get a combination of files in places. And yeah, there's been some really great work that Gordon and Peter, and certainly I've been trying to chip in as well on moving us in this direction. Really appreciate Obsidian and Capano for kind of being a working piece of software that embodies these concepts as well. We've talked a lot about local first software as well. That's another term. If you're not familiar with it, you should definitely look for the original article from Ink and Switch that defined the term local first software. And if you want to kind of hear more conversations like these, there's a podcast by Johannes, which I noticed is sitting in the audience, called localfirst.fm. And that'll kind of take you on the journey of local first, and which really does not 100% overlap with the file over app philosophy, but there's a lot of overlap there. And there's a lot of technology that's being developed that can hopefully get us from where we are in sort of this current ecological conditions to a new place. But Gordon or Peter, do you guys have any closing comments before we wrap up?
I do,
Yeah.
which is I liked Peter's put that we need to make the right thing the easy thing. I think it's actually extraordinarily difficult right now to build an app that puts the user in control of their data in any meaningful sense, almost literally no matter how you define user ownership of data. And the work Peter's doing in CRDTs, and I think the many decentralized protocol projects, including our own, are all attempts at trying to lower the floor so that more people can build apps that actually do put users in control. I think that's necessary, because otherwise it's going to continue to be prohibitively expensive to make that a reality.
Yep, absolutely. Peter, anything to wrap us up?
I don't think we have an answer yet. But I don't mean us here, though, also that. But I think that there's a lot more work to do and a lot more to say. And, I have plenty of pet theories and ideas, as I'm sure everybody here on this call does. But I think I've tried not to fall into solutioneering in this conversation, because I think it's easy to jump into the why don't we just kind of mode. But I think that a good, clear understanding of the opportunity, the challenge, and the benefits, and I just feel like very often people sort of lament the way things are. But I think Gordon's approach to kind of analyzing not just the technical landscape, but the political and cultural landscape as well, is part of why I so enjoy these conversations that we have. And I really thank you, Jess, for allowing me to jump in and be a part of it.
Likewise, it was great.
But yeah, I'm very excited to see folks like yourself, actively engaging kind of one rung closer to sort of market forces. And, I don't think there's a wrong thing to try. If you're doing things I wouldn't, I'm doing things you wouldn't, I think that's great. I'm not here to be a bigot for an approach or a technology. I'll speak my mind and tell you what I think. And if your thing works, I will celebrate, I hope that we all have that mindset of it's not about arguing for ideological purity or the one true solution. I think it's just, we got to get out there and try and make things that work for people, and then see what people say when they try them, and then keep going, keep iterating, keep trying again. So if you're sitting and listening to this, I don't know how many people are here. There's a bunch of people wandered in. Yeah. Go make things, I guess, or try some of the things that we've made and complain about the ways they don't work for you. That's honestly a pretty good contribution too.
Such a gift. All right, guys. Well, thanks. And look forward to the next time I get to chat with both of you.
See you, Jess.
All right.
Take care, y'all.
Oh, hey, and if anybody out there wants to see, I think you're going to the Local First Conf in person, right?
Yes,
Jess?
I will.
Yeah, I'm going to be there. Gordon, are you coming?
I'm so sad to miss it. Yeah, I will not. Yeah. I think it's going to be glorious, though. It's going to undoubtedly be an interesting cross-section of people. I feel like this is an idea that's just breaking into sort of broader consciousness, and the people who have been investing in it for a long time, I'm sure, are all sure to be there. And it sounds like it's going to be a real party.
Yeah, Local First Conf. I mean, not everybody will be there, but hey, that's the idea. Local First Conf. It's in Berlin, end of May. Yeah, you should look it up.
Berlin is amazing too. That should be excuse enough. Oh my goodness. What a place.
Awesome.
Well, thanks,
All right.
Jess. Take care.
See you guys. Bye.